if I can figure out how to do that. Make co-host. There we go. All right. I'll let you explain to everyone who you are.
Sounds good.
All right.
We get everything set up here. Well, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak to the members of the Richmond Weavers Guild about my favorite topic, 19th century coverlets and manuscripts. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, just wanted to check. Getting rid of some things here that are in my way. Can't seem to get rid. Okay. The coverlet on the right was draped across our den sofa. Little did my great-great-grandmother know that the interest she would spark in her great-great-granddaughter. Shortly after I was married, my mother gave me the coverlet on the left. These two coverlets represent the two types of coverlets that were woven by professional weavers. Several years later, I took my first weaving class from a museum in Harmony, Pennsylvania. This started my journey to learn about hand-woven coverlets from the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century. In the 1970s, when I started weaving, there was little written about coverlets. I learned from weaving books how to determine the draft of a coverlet pattern, proceeded to weave coverlets in various patterns and weave structures. Along the way, I learned about handwritten Pennsylvania German manuscripts. By comparing the two, I could document just how to weave a coverlet, how it was made, by whom, when, and where it might have been woven. The why the bed coverlet is basically, to me, it combines art and function, brought to the royal family home. So my master class, I like to say, if I could, I'd love to go spend a day with a 19th century coverlet weaver, but that's not an option. But what my options were in the 1970s and still are today is I could examine 19th century coverlets and pattern manuscripts, and then to learn to interpret the information that they give us. So there's certain tools that I'm going to need. Oops. So I had to learn to analyze. And I start by learning about the design elements of a coverlet. And I needed to understand the number systems for threading drafts, tie-ups, and treadling drafts. Now I have to admit at the beginning of my presentation that I look at coverlets from a weaver standpoint. I'm not good on spinning. I'm not real great at dyeing, and I'm not really into the actual history of things, but I love the weave structures. I'm a numbers person. So I analyze and dissect, and that's how I learned. So we had the extent coverlets. They show us what was woven. At the time, I could find them at the local antique shops. We lived in the Pittsburgh area at the time, antique shows and museums. And then we had the old time cameras, which I went around and took pictures, which tended to be expensive to develop, not like the digital ones today. And then I had pattern manuscripts. And on the left, you see a threading draft. And the right, you see a tie-up. But they often didn't tell us how to treadle it. They figured you were a novice weaver who studied under a master weaver and learned how to do it. So I have to say, when I see a coverlet, I want to figure out the draft. And when I see a draft, I want to write it, put it into a drawdown. So right away, I want to talk to you about drawdowns. They are an integral part of my work. When I came back to weaving in 2005, I had worked as an accountant, so I was pretty comfortable with computers and Excel and all those kind of things. And I found FiberWorks weaving software, and oh, it is great. Instead of these big sheets of graph paper, I now had a software that I could put it in, print it out, and instead of writing out my drafts, maybe 800 threads on pieces of graph paper, I could print it out. One of the important things along the way was to match a coverlet to a drawdown in a draft. And here on the left, we have a 19th century coverlet, and it's in a tulip pattern. And on the right, we see a drawdown from the manuscript that I just showed you. So when I look at a coverlet, I look at it and say, well, what was woven? The yarn used, the motifs used for the pattern, and the weave structure. And from the pattern manuscripts, who might have woven it, what it might have been woven, and when it might have been woven. What I have learned from coverlets, this was that they were woven of cotton and wool. And this particular coverlet is a star and tulip motif, and it's a star work weave structure. And the pattern manuscript was from David Bender from Westmoreland County, who moved out, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, who moved to Iowa. It's also found in the Jacob Anstatt manuscript, who was from Union County in Pennsylvania, who moved to Ohio. Benjamin DeLong manuscript, and also the Jesse Martstellers from Berks County and Bucks County. So what is a coverlet? We're talking about a certain type of bed covering that was woven on a hand loom by a weaver in the 19th century as an early art form. Now, recently, I've gotten to what they call Southern counterpanes, which are very different. So, but we're looking at the woven coverlets from the period. And as I said before, I see it as combining function and art to bring beauty to rural 19th century homes. I have to admit, as I got into coverlets, I couldn't understand why they were pretty much popular between the 1800s to the 1850s was their heyday. And it's like, well, why didn't they keep on liking them? Well, it's like anything, taste change, but I found them magical. We have two types of coverlets, and I'm studying the geometric coverlets. This was shown in Packwood's show in 2007. The pattern is angular and well-defined. The dress for this pattern is found in Jacob Anstatt's pattern manuscript, who started as a weaver in Lewisburg. It is a tied beidervan and woven on 12 shafts. So I have to say, I understand that many of you have your 4-shaft looms and maybe 8-shaft looms, and you never want to be interested in weaving these 18 to 24 shaft types of weaves, but it's nice to understand what historically was woven and understand how they looked at it. And I'm a numbers person, so I always want to try the next thing. The other type of coverlet from this period was what they now call figured in fancy. And as you can see, it has flowers, medallions, houses, trains, and in the cartouche, we see the name Benjamin Anstatt, Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, who is a cousin, or I'm not sure his relationship to Jacob Anstatt, but these are coverlets that I cannot weave. And I've left pretty much the research of them to other weavers, mainly because there's so much to learn about the geometric coverlets. But I do have books that talk about the weavers and list different information. The looms for the geometric coverlet, this is, I called it a barn loom, but a woman I visited down in Virginia said it was a colonial loom. She corrected me. And I guess they call it a Pennsylvania German cantilever loom. They're woven on a loom that has shafts like we have on our contemporary looms. The depths of the loom would determine how many shafts it could be added, but it was much easier to add a shaft than it is for contemporary looms. Each shaft consisted of 2 pieces of wood. And so we have these 2 pieces of wood going horizontally, and then you have string heddles, which you would make on a jig. So it was easy to create another harness, except how many you could fit in the depth of your loom. Now the looms for the figured coverlets have this large attachment on the top. It was, they call it the French jacquard attachment that made it possible to create more distinct patterns. And it was the precursor of the computer cards. It had punch cards, and the needles would go in each time you advanced it to create the pattern. Brief history. The earliest geometric coverlets that have been found are 1773, which Clarita Anderson talked about in her thesis about Maryland coverlets. The earliest figured coverlet that we know of is 1817 from a New York weaver. Figured and fancy coverlets, they're made double weave by the Scotch and the English heritage. They moved from New York to New Jersey to areas of Pennsylvania along the upper Delaware and westward to Ohio and Indiana. So there's two types of weave structures used for these figured and fancy coverlets. One is the double weave, which is like our double weave. And the other is a tied weave, which is very much like the tied Beidervan. It has a plain weave ground and the wool floats over the ground to form the pattern. This weave structure is usually attributed to weavers of German descent. It was developed in the southeast Pennsylvania and moved southward in Maryland, westward through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And reasons for immigration, just briefly to this country. The English moved here pretty much because, and English and Scots moved here because of the Industrial Revolution. And the Germans immigrated to this country because the Maryland weavers' indirect result of William Penn's carefully recruitment in the late 17th century. Also had to do with the flood of cheap English textiles at the European market. Excuse me, I keep hitting the wrong thing here. So now let's look at the design elements. This is something that I'm very interested in, how it's constructed. And I have to say, I see a coverlet as like a piece of canvas. And I don't know if you've been, there's a coverlet museum in Bedford, Pennsylvania, called the National Museum of the American Coverlet. And there you see coverlets on the wall. And I have to say, this is really the way I like to see my woven coverlets, although it's not possible. So, okay, let's start. We're going to, let me get my pointer here. If I can get something out of the way. Okay. So we have our main pattern, which is the center field, and then we have a border pattern on the sides and the bottom. And because this is functional, we don't usually have a fringe at the top, and you don't usually have a border. And the weave structure for this particular one is star work, and then the yarn and the fringe. I probably have a section too large on the fringes. I'm very interested in coverlet fringes. So here we look again at the drawdown. It consists of the threading at the top, the tie-up in the corner, and treadling down the side. Now, I realize many of you know this stuff, but we're going over the basics. It's a graphic representation of a woven pattern. Now let's take a look at what pattern is, and coverlets are all about pattern. You have two or more points or blocks of change to create a pattern motif. So here we have our 2 points that make up the pattern, and I put it sort of like in a profile draft. Top, we have the 1 points and the 2 points, and they vary back and forth to create a checkerboard pattern. Now, if we were to take those points and design to enlarge them, we have a larger pattern, which we'll find is significant in coverlet patterns, because many times they took smaller motifs that were used for bedspreads and things like that, and enlarged them and even used different weave structures. And the two most popular block designs, these are 2 block designs. On the left is your star, and on the right is your rose. And the star has blocks in each corner. And we come with the concept of woven as drawn in. So we go across our profile draft, and we have block 1 2 times, we treadle it, block 2 2 times, and so forth. And we can draw a diagonal line to show woven as drawn in. And here you can see why many of their drafts, their pattern drafts, had only the draft and the tie-up, because they figured you knew woven as drawn in. Now, if we switch those blocks, we create what they call a rose motif. And you can tell it doesn't have the diagonal box. And this is the type of motif you're going to find in the double weave and the more complicated coverlet weave structures. So we have our most popular 4-block pattern, which is called lover's knot. As we can tell, it's woven as drawn in, and we have a star in the corner, a larger star or table in the center, and a star in the corner. And the reverse of this, or companion to this, is the wig rose, where we've done it in rose fashion. And I once years ago did a workshop on talking about the different weave structures and how they all use this wig rose formation. They would have a pattern in each corner and one in the center, and then create variations around it. So I want to show you sort of, if you were a weaver from that period and you wanted to create designs, how we could do that. And that's what I did here. I took my 2-block star motif, and then I added a 3rd block so I had something to separate them. Then I made them a little more interesting, and the blocks were separated by a variation of the star motif. And then I changed the star motif. And then I did what I love to do, which is make trees from the stars. They're all variations of the main patterns. And many coverlets will have 2 rows of star motifs based on the 2 different motifs in the coverlet. And here's even more variations. So I just sat down with my Fiberworks and created these designs, much like the coverlet weaver would have in the 19th century. Now we come to these other motifs. We call these single blocks. They're not joined together. We don't see this as they're all separate from each other. But when you get into the more multi-shaft weave structures, you have what they call a combined block, and it fills in and creates interesting motifs. This would be a single structure, and this would be a combined block structure. And the most popular combined blocks are the snowball motif. And usually, you can see we don't have that diagonal line, so we have a rose fashion. And instead of changing the blocks around, we can just change our tie-up and create the same snowball. And here's a 4-block design I created, similar to the others, but now we have a snowball in the center. And of course, we have to have trees. And we make it a little fancier. And now we get into a totally different group of motifs that you're going to find in coverlets. And they took the Germans, particularly from their linen weaver books, which we'll discuss later on, took their point twill star and used that in the coverlets. Now, what they did with that point twill star is instead of 1 unit, they had 3 units per block, which enlarged the star, which we've decided and creates a more interesting pattern. And then, of course, we can take that star and make it into a tree. And even more interesting with the star motifs is the soldiers that were created on the borders. And even though, now here's some that this soldier in the middle is not very pretty, but it's different. And then there are a lot of tulip motifs. And then we have the star, the flower, and the tree. The main weave structures that I bet if I was to ask you about what you know about coverlets, you would say it was overshot, summer and winter, and double weave, which is very interesting, and they're in the majority of them, but there's a whole bunch of other weave structures we'll look at. So we'll start with the overshot. Now, the characteristic of this weave structure is that it has plain weave. I don't know if you can see, it's large enough, plain weave blocks. It has half tones, and then it has the float work. So basically, I describe overshot as a piece of plain cloth. You have your cotton warp, you have your tabby cotton weft, and you take the blue wool usually or other colors over and under that plain cloth to create a design. Other characteristics are as I just mentioned, cotton warp, wool pattern weft, and cotton tabby. I sort of got ahead of myself. And in threading draft wise, we there's a standard formation for overshot. We have 4 blocks, and block 1 and 2 create this large table. And block 1 is on shaft 1 and 2. Block 2 is on shaft 2 and 3. The small table is on block 3 and 4 with shafts 3 and 4 and 1, 4. And then we have what they call more characteristics to the weave is the blocks share a thread with each other unless they're on opposites. They have an even number of threads in each block unless it's a turning block, and then you have odd. And this is interesting if you get into looking at the old patterns that are written in a profile format, your actual weaving becomes not symmetrical with the halftones because they don't add that extra thread for the turning blocks. So here's our lover's knot pattern. And I thought I'd briefly, before I get further along, just show you what I do with my fabric analysis. I don't know how many fabric analysis I've done over the years. But as I said, it's like seeing the draft I want to put into a drawdown. I see a coverlet and I want to figure out the draft. So I often start with a photograph of the coverlet. And I find where the part that you have the 4 blocks in the treadling, 4 block variations. And then I take one repeat of the pattern. And here's a close-up that shows that repeat of the pattern. And then I put it thread by thread on a graph paper that I create with an Excel. And my accounting skills come out. And then I put that in there. And then I can just go across and fill in the threading draft based on the block 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I come up with my drawdown, which is, I think this is a very pretty pattern. Now, in the northern overshot coverlets, you'll find they're very distinct from the southern ones, usually. They have a pattern, they have a border on the side and a border on the bottom, and they have a fringe on the sides and the bottom. And a lot of them have really neat, fancy fringes. And I have to say, I have bought coverlets on eBay and other places just for the fringe so I could document how it was woven. And then I've woven it. Now, the southern coverlets, this is a show that the Central Virginia Guild told me about in Rocktown History Museum in Dayton, Virginia. And we have, you can see a classic southern coverlet. Instead of having a seam down the middle, it usually had 3 widths. And they usually did not have a border on the side or fringe. But this is a handsome coverlet. Now the summer and winter weave, let's look at the next weave structure. The summer, it requires 1 shaft for each pattern block and 2 shafts for the tie downs. For this pattern, we use 5 shafts for the 5 pattern blocks and 2 for the tie downs. So block 1 is threaded on 3, 2, 3, 1. That's pattern, tie down, pattern, the other tie down. Block 2 is 4, 2, 4, 1, and so forth. And they have 2 basic types of treadling, although there is a third, but the ones you see most often, on the left, you see the singles treadling, and on the right, you see the pairs. And the singles is and the problem with summer and winter is figuring out how to put your treadles together because you have need more treadles than often you have. But then you use 2 pattern treadles for each block, and one uses one tie down and one uses the other tie down. So if you switch those 2 treadles, you come up with the singles. But if you go with a 1 treadle and then 2 of the next treadle, they come up with the pairs, which you can tell is a different look to it. And here's a picture of the coverlet. If you notice, if you don't look real closely, you would think this was double weave. And one of the things for today's weavers is they can study the double weaves and they can use them and make summer and winter patterns of anything that they like. And here's a different summer and winter coverlet. And here's one that shows the pairs treadling up close. But they didn't do the 1 and then 2 and 2 and 2. They started out with 2, 1 and 2 of the other. And it creates almost sort of a lacy look. And here's a summer and winter coverlet with the singles. I don't find as many summer and winter coverlets, and they're usually considered the British woven, and they're woven in the north. So double weave. Double weave is most handsome of the coverlets. You actually have 2 warps and 2 wefts forming 2 layers of cloth. And the warps switch layers when they switch at the edge of the block of the pattern. If you only have 2 colors, it creates a reversible coverlet with a dark and a light side. And here's my family coverlet. This is the block design for it. So when I've analyzed this type, I usually just put it in block format, and then I know how to thread it. And it's too complicated to actually put in the draw down. And there's again a picture of my family coverlet. And notice it has trees from the slates in the middle, and it has trees from the roses. Here's a different double weave. Almost looks like playing cards to me for some reason. Here's one I love, the Virginia Beauty, I think is what they call this center motif. And then, of course, they have trees, and it's separated by these red squares. And here's a close-up. So in the close-up, you can see that it's plain weave, and it's very distinct. And it really is, I think, probably the most handsome in color and striking of all the coverlet weave structures. Now, because this has 2 colors against the white, you're going to have a checkered part on the back. And here's a different double weave. I really like the trees in this. I thought it was funky. And you have the trees out of the roses, and then you have the trees out of some type of motif here. And on the back, you have the lighter side, and you have some of those checkerboards. Now we're going to get into when I came back to weaving in 2005, and I got it really into the Pennsylvania German float work, and they're not always as striking in appearance, but they're very interesting to study and weave. And so there again, I looked to my coverlets that I found and the patterns in the Pennsylvania German manuscripts. So we have multi-shaft float work, point twill derivatives, star work, tied binder von, and block turn twill. And as I don't expect to give you a quiz at the end of this, I'm just trying to give you the highlights of the weave structures. And this one's interesting because it has 2 ways you can treadle it, but in this way it's treadled. There again, it's like the summer and winter, it used 2 treadles for each block, and it creates what I call checkerboard halftones. It's very hard to photograph. So this is my coverlet, and it's my old early coverlet. I have trouble getting a clear picture of it. Another float, multi-shaft float work is there again, we have this same motif that we saw in the double weave. And then they separate it, and they use the colors. Then we get into a study I've done on star point twills. I have a website, coverletweaver.com, and I have the articles I've written for my study group out there that explains these further if you're interested. And this one I characterize as the star point twill. You have 9 point twill stars, and then you have them separated by other motifs. And here you can see that the weave structure, but by looking at the draft, you have the point twill. And then these blocks up here are like regular overshot or float work. And you combine the 2. And here's a different coverlet, very much like it. And the thing you find in the manuscripts is these were woven as regular twills, and they were woven as plain weave foundations. And you can tell which way it was woven by looking at the tie-up. If it has plain weave treadles, you know that you have the plain weave. Now here's a different type of variation, and I haven't found too many of these. And essentially you have the point twill star, and then you have 2 blocks on opposites to create your pattern, which I think is very striking. And then we have trees, and this one has these really weird trees I haven't found in another coverlet. And here is my drawdown. And by doing the drawback, you can really dissect it and see the weave structure, how it works. We have that point twill star, and it's a quarter star in the tie-up, And then we have these 2 blocks on opposites. And here's a very unusual type of draft that I found in manuscripts the first time I was weaving, and I only had a 16 shaft loom then, which I know sounds silly to say only, but for these weaves you needed more. And it's one where you sort of the treadling overlaps each other, and you can put something on 16 shafts that would normally take more. And this same type of grouping of rows of flowers and stars. Here's that funny looking soldier motif. And here again, we see this usually has bands of trees, bands of flowers and little trees, and bands of these funny looking creatures. Another group that I call under the point twill variations is the window pattern. And here again, I'm looking this time more at the draft as it appears. And we have what I call window panes here. And then we have a table of lattice-like diamonds. And then they have the border on the 3 sides. And here, I should have done this differently. You can't really see the draft too well because I've left it in numbers. And you can see the zigzag, like a point twill, which is used to create the tables, or the windows, I should say. And then you have the point twill for the lattice-like tables, and then you just have the background. And this is what you notice I talked about a 9-star, and I talked about a window pattern. And in this case, they dropped the lattice-like tables and combined the 2, and this is one of my favorites. And then we have the final group that I added in here, which is sort of stretching it a bit. And it's a weave structure that crosses from point twill and a look of biter vine. And you actually find some of these in true all biter vine, but it creates this dog paw, and it's separated by a point twill table. And here you can see it. Well, there again, I should take the numbers out so you can see it better. But I have some other shots of this. You can see the zigzags that are used to create each of these. These are cross motifs. So you have 8 cross motifs, and sometimes you have cross motifs in the center. And here's your little table. These usually take about 18 shafts. And here's another dog paw. Now we get into something that has fascinated me from way, way back when, because we see here, it looks like a star. Well, it is a star, but it's an enlarged star. And here's where we took the point twill star and enlarged it. And I'll show you close up. And here's a coverlet. And here's another version of the same type. And I don't know if you can see, hopefully, in here, the threading for something like this, you have the blocks in point twill variation, and then you have tie downs. So you'll have here, I'm not sure how many threads, it's 18 shafts. So I'll have 18, 1, 18, 17, 2, 17, and working my way down. And it creates these longer floats that you couldn't have in a small motif that's just a star. And there shows you can find them from 2 to about 7 threads for each block. And this one uses, okay, this is the unique, this is one of these weird, unique things that just trust me, it creates longer floats. And for some reason, I have a talk I can do on just star works. And they have like 9 variations out there of different ways they constructed it. And to me, this is very interesting, but I'm not going to spend today with all of them. And then we have the tied biter vine, which is similar to what we found in the figured and fancy coverlets. And it's characteristic by the fact we have we'll have 4 pattern blocks, shafts together, and then we'll have a tie down, 4 pattern tie down. So we have a 4-to-1. And this creates these lines that we can see as characteristic of the tied biter vine. And it there again, like this, the summer and winter, it uses many of the block designs you'll find in double weave, and it's not real common. And here's a coverlet, which I think is beautiful in that pattern. Okay, the final group we're going to come up, we've looked at double cloth, we've looked at what they call half double cloth, which is the float works, and now we're going to take a quick look at the singles, which has one warp and one weft. And these were terms that were used in the early manuscripts. So here we have that point twill star I told you about. So we have 4 stars, and then we have a lattice-like table, and then we create a border around the edges. And as you see, it's a much more muted pattern, and it's much smaller. And then we have the group of point twills, which are normally 16 shafts, and they create diamonds with the point twill. And then they will stripe both the warp and the weft. This just doesn't the weft. Sometimes they stay within a diamond, and sometimes it's hit or miss. And here's the actual coverlet. So you see the red and blue in the warp, and where they cross, they sort of wash each other out, but you can see the pattern when they are of contrasting wool. And finally, we have the turn twill, which are in an old manuscript, you will see a profile draft, and then next to it, you will see a tie-up for a turn twill, and you'll see a tie-up for a double weave. And they couldn't be more different in appearance once they're woven. But both of them require 4 shafts per block. So for this 4 block, it would take 16 shafts. And here's a turn twill. They're very muted in appearance. And here's one where it's more striking. And finally, they have the combination weave, where they actually take the point twill and combine it with a turn twill. Or I guess recently, an authority I know says I should call these block twills. And this is a picture of the coverlet. Oh, I keep saying finally, but I keep coming up with a different weave structure. This is called gebroken, which is a broken twill. So instead of having overshot blocks or turn twill, we have these diamond-like. Here again, we look at the drawdown to see what it looks like. You don't see many of these, but there are out there. And this was a type of weave and block design you'd see in tablecloths from the period. Okay, we're going to briefly look at yarns. So we used hand-spun wool, natural cotton, and sometimes linen. And here's my introduction to a color wheel. Red was from cochineal or madder, and blue from indigo, and they were the colors predominantly used for coverlet weaving, although you'll see greens and golds as well. And now I probably are going to show you more than you want to know because I love fringes. They frame the coverlet on 3 sides. And the most common form of fringe on coverlets, this would be your plain weave foundation type of weave. So you can just stick the wool weft out the sides and your cotton will bind the edges. And then they would just they weave an inch or so of plain weave and then just let the warp hang, which I guess if you're putting it on a bed, that would be hidden by the footboard anyway. And here's one of the more elaborate fringe. In the 1970s, when I was first doing that, a friend brought me a coverlet from when she had been out on a trip and came back with it. And I sat down with a piece of paper and figured out how to weave this. And I've woven this many, many times. And here's a close-up. You can see I call it a tied fringe. So you would have, this would be your warp. You'll have 2 strips of warp, and then you have separations, and you weave back and forth, and then you periodically pick up the cotton and tie it like with a buttonhole loop. It makes a lovely fringe. It takes time, but you know, I'm not weaving these to sell, so I can take my time. And here's my diagonal, my diagram of the fringe. There's 2 types. One is I call diagonally tied, and the other is called parallel tied. And I found both types out there. So this is the parallel, excuse me. forgetting myself here. The diagonal tied. And here is when you're weaving it on the loom, and you can show, I showed you where I'm actually taking the linen color warp and tying the bundles. This is one of my favorite coverlets that it's as the Coverlet Museum. And you see close-ups of the fringe. Here you can see where you'd have 3 strips in your warp of the cotton, and you'd weave back and forth, and they chose to just have the wool and different wool, and then I guess I forget, and they had white natural wool as well in the coverlet. It's very handsome. And here's how you would see it on a loom to do this particular. And there again, I'm going back to my parallel. Another type of fringe, which is lovely, is the lino lace fringe. And you would weave 2 ways. You would weave your coverlet, and then at the bottom, for the bottom part, you would have a plain weave area. You'd leave a space unwoven, and you'd have your pattern area, and then you'd leave a part unwoven, and you would go back with a thread and twist these by hand. Now for the sides, what you would be doing is taking the extra warp at the bottom of your coverlet warp and weaving these bands and then sewing them together. Here's some other versions of it. So here's my diagram. So I have pattern band, nothing woven, pattern band, nothing woven, another area for the fringe. And then I can go back, I go under 6, back over 3, under 3, and then I pull it. And that creates the tension for the lino. Another well-known thread, fringe that you see both on the figured fancy and the geometric is tape fringe. This one has a very handsome fringe. Let me show you the close-up. You can see it was all wool, and then you had a band on your loom, and you wove the wool back and forth. Now I have to say, when I've woven this, and I haven't used it a lot in my weaving, but when I have, I've sat there with a I'll show you the next slide. So I would sit there, weaving it back and forth, and then I'd have a small shuttle with sewing machine thread, and I'd weave the edges. Now I know they didn't do that on the old ones, but it annoyed me to see it coming unwoven, and usually what it would do was felt. But for my own things, I extemporize. This is a 2-shaft loom from the Hancock Shaker Village Museum, which would have been perfect for the fringe. And here you see me weaving it on a loom. I don't know if I tried it on a regular tape loom, and you don't have any guide, at least I haven't figured out a good way to have a guide thread on the side, which you need to catch your edge to form the fringe. And here's a coverlet I'd woven with the tape fringe. And here's another variation of the tape fringe. They come in many types, and it's a very popular fringe to use. And here they do, we see that we have the weft fringe on the side, and then we have warp fringe, the tape fringe at the bottom. Okay, we've taken our look at the coverlets. I hope I'm not losing anybody along the way, but now we're going to take a look at the drafts. My other.
Okay, before you go, I have 2 questions.
Okay.
The first one was, how many shafts were in the star and tulip coverlet back at the beginning?
It's around 18. I'm not positive. I'd have to look it up.
Okay. And then the second question was, the 12 shaft float work slide looked like tied overshot.
Okay.
Is multi-shaft float work and tied overshot the same thing?
Yes. But I tend to keep the term of overshot for the 4-shaft version, and the others I call float work, but that's an important point to make. Is that it?
That's it.
Okay, we'll go on and look. I'm just going to skim through this, but I wanted you to have a sense of it. And there again, I'm not giving a quiz at the end. But the British immigrants who came to this country had some published weaving books from their homelands. Well, I guess this one, the one is, I take it back. But these were the English weavers in this country published these books in Baltimore, Maryland. The first is John Hargrove, The Weaver's Draft Book, and Joseph France, The Weaver's Complete Guide. And then the others that were published in this country were The Domestic Manufacturer and the Philo Blakeman, which a lot of these you can get in reproduction copies by Dover. Now, the weaving, I guess the ones that truly were brought over from another country were the German books. And they actually had published linen books in 1677 by Mark Ziegler. And Nathaniel Lumpshire was in 1711. And they could have brought these over with it, or it had the knowledge of them. And then we have Johann Michael Frickinger, Johann Michael Kirschbaum, and George Senewald. And when you look at these books, you feel like you're looking at coverlet drafts. The block designs were brought here and used for the coverlets, where they were used with linen weaving in Germany. But the star work weave, which enlarges the star, is truly an American weave structure. But then we get to the part which I like. The others are just sort of introductions, where now we look at, there's many, many versions and reproduce copies of the Pennsylvania German pattern and account manuscripts. So I'll just show you, get a little flavor of what you're going to look at. We have the Peter Diller, his book, February 9th, 1839, and there's a picture of it on the left. It said it was the Peter Diller draught book containing a variety of single and double, 3/4 and diaper, which he wrote in it. I guess he wrote both of these things, excuse me, that's what's over here, and shows a part for the loom. And then it went on to say coverlet patterns for single and double and 3/4 coverlets. And diaper, this contains a variety of drafts of each kind set by Peter Slothier. So he was a student or novice weaver to Peter Slothier in 1835. And many of these manuscripts were written while they were docent or studying under a master weaver, and they took those with them. And some of them were quite large. You can't imagine that they wove all of them. And so here's an example of what a page would look like. We have the draft on the left, and we have the tie-up on the right. It's a combination of block twill and point twill. Shafts, 3 to 12 shafts, 8 shafts for the point twill. I guess it's a combination of 20. 12 for the 3 block. Okay, I'm not understanding my writing. So 3 block makes 12 and 8 shafts for the point twill for a total of 20. And this is the drawdown of it. Now, double work, snowball with tree border. So we have the draft on the left, and then we have the tie-up on the right. But nobody telling us how to treadle this. They figure you know how to do it. And a lot of times in the draft, they will give you the number of the tie-up. And here's my block design. Diller's float work. This is a very popular sort of, it's multi-shaft float work and borders on being star work. So we see our draft on the left and our tie-up on the right. So here we have that point twill look, but they are 6 threads in each block. And for some reason, they did this on opposites, which they didn't need to. And this is our diamond, very well-known Baltimore quilt pattern. Then I showed you the window pattern earlier, which is a favorite of mine. We see the draft on the left and the tie-up on the right. And here's our drawdowns. So now we know what the pattern does, what it's going to look like, and we can take it and match it to a coverlet we found to know that these were woven from these manuscripts and approximately who, when, and where they would have been woven. Another variation is my star works, my favorite star work. And on the left, we have the draft, and on the right, we have tie-ups. And here we have our drawdown. So we have the star work here, and then we have the point twill stars in half. So it switches back, and then we have little blocks in between. Another manuscript, and there again, some of these are on my website with just examples of them. And one I've studied extensively is the Jacob Biesecker one from Franklin Township, Adams County. And you can find it by clicking on this on my website at Winneture. Here's the window pattern again. And they actually give you the draft and the treadling. You would take this treadling and sort of rotate it, and you'd have your plain weave over here and then your patterns going there. So they actually told you how to, it's rather complicated, so it's a good thing they did. And voila, we have our drawdown. Now here we have the small 9-star that I like so well. And you can see there again, they show you the draft and the treadling and the tie-up on one page. And it comes out to be the classic 9-star with these 9 stars and lattice-like table. And usually these take about 18 shafts. Then we come to that same diamond pattern that we saw over in the Diller manuscript, and it's called patchwork here. And you see the profile draft and the profile treadling. And here's the tie-up. So we have that diamond, a slightly different variation. It's a float work, what I call multi-shaft float work, but you could consider it to be overshot. And here's my favorite again, the Joseph Cap draft with a drawdown. So we're coming to the conclusion here where we're back to the beginning of my presentation where I matched a draft to a coverlet by preparing drawdowns of each. So on the left here, we have an example of the dog paw. Here's the draft and the drawdown. Here's a coverlet, which if you look in the background, if you can see later, I have them behind me, and here's the drawdown. And we put them side by side. Now, these aren't a perfect match like the one in the beginning, but I can compare the two drawdowns and know that the dates and who might have woven them. Excuse me. Sorry. I had asked for any of your members to send me pictures of coverlets and I could analyze them. And I was meaning to look at the geometrics, but here's one that's a figured in fancy. So what we can figure out, we can look at the medallion patterns. In the corner, we have Jacob Darren, 1846 in Washington. I looked him up in my books. He's born January 5th, 1807, and he died in 1887. His extant coverlets are 1835 to 1855, and he had various locations in York County. It was a figured in fancy coverlet of 1846, so we can see that sort of in that middle period when he was weaving coverlets. And it's of a tied weave, and it has 2 patterns to 1 tied, woven out of red, gold, and dark blue wool, medallion motifs, rows of stars along the border. And many collectors like this, the figured in fancy, because they will tell them in the cartouche who wove them, where they wove them, and the date, and possibly who it was woven for. In the case of my family coverlet, it has my great-great-grandmother's name and date and where it was woven, but not the weaver. So my conclusion, I'm not finished yet. This is the conclusion of the early drafts. They illustrated their creativity through unique and artistic coverlets they designed and wove. My master class is self-taught but guided by the coverlets and manuscripts from the early period. And now I'd like to show you some of the things I wove based on my research. So I'm going to, here's some brief information. I'm going to stop the share. And if I'm lucky, I'll find my other one. And any questions before I go on? Okay. Things are getting in the way for me to see what I need to see. Okay. Give me a minute. Okay. Too many things here. Now, can you just see my slide? You don't see my whole presentation thing?
You just see the slide.
Good, because I forgot to sign out of the one type to get back into the other. Okay, so now I'd like to show you what I've woven over the years. And my when I came back to weaving, I found the Helene Bress books that are these huge 2-volume books on coverlets that she did while I wasn't weaving. And I thought, well, you really got all the information you'd ever want here, but I like the discovery of it. I like taking things from the original primary source and weaving them myself. And I found over the years, it's the way you truly understand what was woven. So let's take a look. Designing my own traditional coverlets. The first coverlet I wove in 1976, we had bought it at an antique shop somewhere, and it's an overshot, and it is a sunrise coverlet, and it has these sort of head things in it, which I really liked. And I analyzed, put it on graph paper and figured out the draft, and I wove the coverlet exactly like the original coverlet. And then I put the weft fringe on the side, and then I added some fringe at the bottom. I like to start simple when I'm doing something for the first time, but then I got to my second coverlet. And I took my family coverlet, and I showed you the block formation of it, and I wove it in 1977 in summer and winter weave. And I have to say, I wasn't really enthralled with the summer and winter weave. I don't think I used the right combinations, but I put my initials and the date. And then I got into double weaves. And I had 16 shafts, so I only could do 4 block patterns. So I was sort of creating my own patterns by taking the motifs from the early ones. And many of the early ones have 20 shafts. They have 5 blocks, but you can just change it around. Another part when I was weaving is my star works. This is where I learned about star works before I read about it anyplace else. And I figured out that it had to be related to the point twill stars, because this was an enlarged form of these point twill versions. And then on your right is that point twill 4-star that I showed you earlier. And I wove an example of it. So each one of these coverlets during this period was a study in weave structure and pattern. And then I took a block design that was 7 blocks out of the Jacob Anstack book and did it in tied biter bond. And because it was 7 blocks, I had needed 2 shafts for each block, which gave me 14, and 2 for the tie down. So it was a perfect for my 16 shaft loom. And then I had to try the lino lace fringe. Now I left for a while, and then I returned in 2005. And I'll show you a little bit what I've been doing since then. I got this coverlet, and there again, I found an example of my early loom and purchased one with 16 shafts. But this was 18 shafts. And it's a star and diamond, they were calling them then, and then with these quirky trees. And you can see that the trees in the bottom have to be different than the trees on the side based on the constraints of the weft. So I put it in a drawdown, figured it was 18. And then I'm not showing you here. I guess I don't have a slide of that. I actually reduced the number of blocks in the design so that it would work on my 16. and wove a runner. And I looked at it and I thought, that's really not big enough. Since I've taken out a couple blocks, it makes it smaller. So I turned around, and instead of having 3 block units for each block, 3 thread units for each block, I made them into 5, which enlarged the pattern, which was the concept of Starworks. And these were my samples. And here was my choice of color for my final one. And here's my drawdown. And here I'm weaving the coverlet on my loom. Here we have the 2, when you weave a coverlet with border on the sides and the bottom, you weave 2 halves. So in one, you're starting the border at the bottom there, and then you're starting with no border at the top and the border at the bottom and cutting them in half. And I wove my fringe that I love. And here's a corner of the finished coverlet. I've only woven 5 full-size coverlets since I came back, because I like to do the smaller ones to try different things out. And I was working full-time when I started. And here's a picture of the full coverlet. And you have to gather it around the edges, which is tricky at times. And my husband went to a show at the local historical society. We live in the county seat for Cumberland County. And he came home with this picture. And it turned out I had seen the pattern years ago in an old manuscript, and it was called Cumberland Star.
Can I interrupt you for a second before you get too far away?
Sure.
Someone asked if you could show your Starwork coverlet draft again.
Okay, sure. It's easy to do.
Yeah.
There we go. Now, if anybody's interested in any of these, I can send you the WIF files in the digital format. More than happy to share. Of course, I like pictures if you weave something from them.
Yeah, Jeannie's been asking these questions through the Zoom, and I'm sure she'll get in touch with you for that.
Okay, I know Jean. Okay, can I go on?
Yes, please.
I'm just trying to give you a flavor of, I found so many times thinking how it's woven and how they did it is different from actually doing it. So anyway, we come to this. This is the draft I saw years ago. And it was in the Christian Fry manuscript. And then I saw it in another, in the Jacob Biesecker manuscript as well. And they do call it Cumberland Star, but these are 2 Adams County manuscripts. But at one point, Cumberland County was a bigger circumference than it is when these were done. So I think that's the reason. And I wove a small version of what I call throw size. I like to call them coverlet wall hangings / throw coverlets with my pattern, my border on the side and fringe. And I have a special way of doing fringe at the bottom. I think I show you. I learned it the first time around, but I can't figure out where, and I've never seen it on a coverlet. Whoops. We lost. I move around too much here. And here's the full size. Oh, then I took on this study, and I had done this years ago. First time around, I did it a second time, where I actually take 4 to 6 blocks from double weave coverlets, and I design them in Starworks on the odd tide drafting system. And this is it's not as easy as summer and winter, but it makes longer floats and I think a stronger pattern. But you have to play around with it to have it work. Now, this is a double weave that I wove years ago. And then I put it in the profile form. Now, these blocks that have been solid in double weave now had to be 2 blocks because you couldn't have long floats. And you have to create it in such a way that the blocks in each corner are float blocks. It's tricky, but it's fun. And here's my drawdown. And here's my small coverlet / wall hanging. I now put hems at the top and bottom of I put 14 yards on the loom, and then I weave 3 or 4 in different variations. And with the smaller piece, I use only 1 row of tied fringe. And I have my trees. And this is a closer version, a close-up of it. And here's me weaving the fringe again. Now I have, this is an early early Beidervon coverlet. And here's another version of it, a different version of the same block design. And these are 2 of the smaller pieces I wove in the Beidervon, do different color combinations. And then I wove the big piece. And I have yet to put the fringe along the bottom. And here's the finished coverlet. Another pattern I fell in love with, a friend of mine owned this coverlet. And you can see it's the star work, and then your float blocks, and then the point twill, which creates these squat ones and long ones. I just thought it was a pleasing pattern. And here's a smaller piece that I tried. And these days I was trying the smaller pieces, then weaving the big ones. And here's my partial drawdown. And here again is the 2 halves of the coverlet that I've woven and put on the lawn. And there again, I had to do the tied fringe that I like so well. And there's a corner version of the fringe. It's one of those things, it takes a long time, but you know, you have something special when you're done. Oh, then I got into, now this one I didn't think was as good a pattern for a large coverlet. It was good for a small one. And we have our windows and stars. And here is the draft, and here is the tie-up. And then I saw it in coverlets. And here is my drawdown of the pattern. And here's the original coverlet. And I found these in different color combinations. And now we have my smaller piece and the larger. It's a pattern that's a little bit too busy for a full-size coverlet. If I'm hanging on the wall somewhere, it doesn't quite speak to you. And then I played around and I put trees at the bottom, which weren't on the side. But yeah, I am a traditional coverlet weaver, but I don't constrain myself to weave it just like the old ones. This is a pattern that I could not weave with my 16 shaft loom. I tried, and it was in a book, and it had these soldiers at the bottom, but there was just no way to take this 18 shafts to 16. But then I got a 20 shaft Maycomber, so I could do it. And I wove several different warps, and usually the trees, the soldiers are just at the bottom, but I varied it and put them as stripes throughout. And here was now we're getting into my tulip phase. Or you'll see some of my tulips. But this is the early coverlet, and it has this enlarged tulip, and then it has these float work on opposite blocks. And then it has trees, which aren't too visible. So in 2013, I got a 24 shaft Toika computer assist loom. And for me, it wasn't a stretch because I'd planned all these things in Fiberworks before anyway, so I could just integrate it on a loom. And what's fun when you're threading it is you have your draft on the computer assisted, and you put it into a straight draw, and then you just press a treadle. But like anything, I had the draft written out, and I followed it along and had it in 1 inch bundles because I could have made a mistake. And one time I did in my draft and found the mistake. But here again, when I did the original, the pattern was too large. I was doing 20 threads to the inch, and many times the older coverlets are 30 and 40. So I reduced the size of the pattern by taking, instead of, let's say, 7 thread blocks, I took 5. I don't remember the exact. And I came up with a smaller pattern. And these are as I said, 14 yards in different variations. And it is a star work, in case I didn't mention that. And these are the other 2. comes up with many different appearances. And then along the way, I have to say, this is something I wove that I didn't quite totally understand. And Judith Gordon, who'd written the book on star work coverlets, wrote an article for the Complex Weavers Journal on these 4 ties. The systems I looked at all had 2 tied systems. And this is a coverlet owned by a friend of mine, which was also in the article, and it had the draft in it. And I made sure that the draft matched this particular coverlet because there were several different variations of it. And here's my drawdown, a close-up of it. But I didn't understand it totally to play with it too much. But I love the pattern, so I didn't care. And here's 1/4 of it. This is the star work, and these are your float works on opposites. And then the tree. And I varied the tree at the bottom from the sides, which I figured was my artistic license. Maybe it didn't bounce it. I'm not a proponent of having everything totally square in float work. I like the elongation sometimes. I think it creates tension. And here I'm weaving it on my loom. And here's my variations, which is fun. Oh, now I'm getting into some fringes that I did along the way, and I did for this coverlet. The original overshot coverlet, the fringe doesn't look like much. It's rather stringy, but there again, I wrote it down on a piece of paper, and then I wove it. And this is my favorite, was the blue and white. And I have another different tulip or star one where I use this blue and white with this off-white fringe in what I called the step. Let's see. Okay, now here it comes into my final latest project for this. And it was out of a Benjamin DeLong manuscript. And it was really hard to even read. And it shows a quarter, it has the tie up and it shows the draft. And it was one of those weird Starworks threading systems which gave you longer floats. And I found a matching coverlet. And I have to say the coverlet was well used and not too striking. I have a coverlet behind me today that is a different variation that is in good shape, and I fell in love with it years ago, but this is the different variation. And here's my drawdown of the star, which matched both. These were a match to both the draft and the coverlet. But I found along the way, because I have my computer assisted loom, there were 3 different tie-ups I could do. And here is the regular star work version of it with these halftones. But if you go over, because of this weird system, you can do it in the tied Beidervan treadling, which gives a different look. And you can use the single tie down, which gives the 3rd look. So I did. And I did runners of each to get a feel for what they look like. Now here's my coverlet with the original star work and the weft fringe on the side and the warp fringe on the bottom. Excuse me, the weft here. And this is what I put in with a crochet hook. I guess I didn't put this in my description today. If anybody's interested, I can send you pictures. So I did samples. I was originally going to do 3 different fringes for 3 different pieces. And then I thought, that wouldn't look nice on them. So I tried to figure out what I would really like on each one of them. And this is I did samples of the tied, and this is the V-shaped, which is another variation. And I ended up with these, still have a lot of fringes I can use on other coverlets. And this was my sampling. And here's weaving the fringe for the 3rd piece, which was my favorite. It has, instead of being the wool for your main color, you have the cotton with the ties in the wool. Now here's the Beidervan. For this one, I used the tied fringe in the wool. And here's my favorite, is the one tied system and the tied fringe with the cotton and the wool. So my conclusion for today is that 19th century weavers illustrate their creativity through unique artistic coverlets they designed and wove. My weaving is inspired by the work of the Pennsylvania German weavers and the other weavers as well. My master class is self-taught but guided by the coverlets and manuscripts from the early weavers. And thank you for your attention today. You have any questions? Shall I stop the share and then we can look at questions?
If anyone online has questions, just unmute and ask.
I didn't know whether to leave. Well, we'll stop it. I can always find it again. I hope I didn't overwhelm you. It's just an overview.
It was wonderful. Thank you. Anyone
Okay.
here have questions? You kept many of us very awed and entertained, and
Yeah, as I
we
said,
learned a lot.
I know that a lot of them are woven on multi-shaft that most of you won't want to weave, but when you see old coverlets, you'll have a sense of what was done and how they were woven and have an appreciation of what the weaver did. And what I'm amazed at is they had supposedly spinners bring their wool to the weaver, and then he would weave it. And that he had these looms that seemed rather rudimentary, but you have these precisely woven coverlets that are beautiful. So I have this very sophisticated loom doing the same stuff.
They figured out things that we could not do.
Right. Well, they unfortunately they weren't like me. They didn't get to just weave coverlets. They had to weave some very utilitarian type of things to make a living. I have the pleasure of doing what I want when I want. So, and thank you for inviting me. I appreciate your attention today.
Well, thank you. And some of us are looking forward to seeing you at Martha.
Oh, good, good. I'll be there. My latest thing is counterpanes. Somehow along the way, in 2017, two friends of mine bought a group of drafts at a Virginia auction in Rockingham County. And I got to see them. And I didn't know anything about cotton counterpanes. So I taught myself. And there's not a lot, there again, there's not a lot written out there. So I've become, but they're beautiful, these third dimension and what I call nooks and crannies. I have a whole talk about it if you want to ever hear it, but I'm fascinated with them. And I keep weaving samples and my husband keeps saying, well, when are you going to need something bigger? So I'm into towels these days.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate doing this. And as I said, some of us look forward to seeing you at Moffat.
And who is there that's going to Moffat? Can you introduce yourself? And what's your name?
You have to come on. I'm Susan Quell.
Oh, good.
Email back and forth.
Yes, we have Susan.
And I'm Janet McAvoy. We've emailed too.
Okay. Are you the one that doesn't have FiberWorks?
I don't have the width file. My computer wore out and we have another computer. And
well, maybe I can inspire you.
I have it on my big computer. I need to download it again onto my laptop.
Right. But you know what? Everybody likes different things. Yeah. I don't presume to inflict myself on anyone. I enjoy what I'm doing and hope you can enjoy my enthusiasm.
Well, we're looking forward to it.
Looking forward to meeting you or seeing you. Now I've met you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.